back on the show. Welcome.
Guy, I'm glad to be on, but you got me on this long drink. I'm kind of curious. I'm going to have to hang on and find out later what exactly you're talking about.
You know what? It's so funny. We had Governor Sununu from New Hampshire on the show earlier in the week, and he heard the same little spiel, and he asked the same exact question on the air. And maybe that's why they do this. They want the guests to get curious and ask the question. It's really good if you're into sort of like refreshing citrus sodas with a little premium liquor kick. It's great in the summer. Definitely check it out, thelongdrink.com, Senator. You will not regret it. You can let me know. Next time you come on, you'll have to tell us what you think of the long drink.
Well, my wife and my daughter are the gold standards of this type of drink. So I promise you, I'm going to go get some and ask them to taste test it, and I'll let you know.
Okay, very good. And they might even sell you on this. I'm just telling you. In fact, a couple of years ago, our colleague at Fox, Martha McCallum, she was having me and my husband over for dinner, and her husband was there and her kids were there. And we brought, instead of a bottle of wine, we brought over a 6-pack of long drink. And they were like, oh, okay, that's interesting. And they put it in the fridge. And I wasn't sure if they would ever take it out of the fridge. But the next day, Martha texted me and she said, what is this stuff? It's amazing. Where do you get it? And so I sent her links to the closest liquor stores. I know where she lives. And so she's become a fan. So report back on your wife and your daughter. It sounds like a pretty good plan. Okay. I think Long Drink has gotten their money's worth here. And, of course, we're talking about them later in the hour, too. Senator, let's talk about politics. I know that you have some strong feelings about the debt limit bill that has now been made law. It was passed in the House, debated yesterday in the Senate, and then passed after that debate. Just give us your broad strokes. I know the fight is over now, but where did you come down on it and why?
Well, we voted against this legislation. Guy, I think we all knew that this was two huge storms that were brewing and headed for collision, the storm of the national debt as well as the debt limit. And they were coming together, and when two storms finally collide, it's going to be bad. And we're disappointed in the leadership of the White House. We can get back to that. But at the end of the day, this legislation adds another $1.3 trillion of debt over this year and probably more next year. I think that just fuels inflation. When we say borrow money from our grandchildren, they're printing it. That's going to fuel inflation. What we also would hope to get out of this were some type of work requirements. And really, when we read the fine print, the work requirements disappeared. And then finally, we were hoping to get some permitting reform. And at the end of the day, the permitting reform we saw was dust in the wind. It evaporated. There was nothing there. And so there just wasn't enough there for me to support it. Again, I feel like Leader McCarthy did everything he could with the hand he was dealt. And everyone needs to understand that he only controlled about one half of one of the three levers that do the funding appropriations. So he did the best he could. I couldn't have done better. I don't criticize him, but we didn't have any leadership out of the White House to circumvent this borrowing of money that's just piling on the inflation.
Well, they don't want to, right? If they could, they would spend more and borrow more, right? That's their plan. So that's what McCarthy was also up against, right? Not just people who wouldn't negotiate for months, people who, if they got their way, they would do a clean debt ceiling increase or like a dirty one with more money spent. That's their goal, right? So that's part of the challenge here.
Yeah, Guy, you're spot on. So instead of borrowing $1.3 trillion this year, Biden had hoped to probably borrow 1.4, 1.5. But here's the sad news. Last night, Chuck Schumer promised he was going to come back and borrow more money for the Ukraine war. And that's kind of a different subject, but nevertheless, they're not done. They're not done spending. And boy, when I listen to folks back home, what they're still concerned about is the price of gas, groceries, their rental, their rent, those types of things. That's what they're concerned about, their safety, security. But this is going to just drive inflation. What's the Fed's going to do now? But raise interest rates. We had a strong jobs report, and now we've got this debt done. We're borrowing more money. What would you do if you were the Fed? You've got to slow down inflation somehow. It's just this tiger chasing its tail.
You mentioned your travels around Kansas and what you're hearing back home from constituents. How often are you home? Because it's an interesting balance for members in the Senate or the House to do the job in D.C., but also stay true to the roots in the communities that elected you. How often are you home? And when you talk to people, what are you hearing? Because I know there's a lot of consternation and pain out there that D.C. doesn't always feel, but folks elsewhere absolutely do. It's their reality every day.
Yeah, I so appreciate you asking this question. I've been in Congress for 6 years. I've spent 6 weekends in D.C. Now, when I'm back in Kansas, I seldom get to my home that I'm constantly around the state. I think we did 15 roundtables last week. And I can tell you by far and away what people are concerned about in Kansas is, number one, is a drought. And that's important because a third of our wheat crop is going to have to be plowed under. But you get beyond the drought, and it's inflation. It's a lack of people for the jobs we have. It's their safety and security. That's what folks are talking about. And I want to come back and just chat about how inflation impacts a farmer. So a farmer should be harvesting that wheat crop any day now. And this fall, they'll need to borrow money. The average farmer probably has about $1 million operation loan. So 2 years ago, they were paying 2% for this operation loan. This year, it's going to be 6 or 7%. That's how inflation impacts a farmer in Kansas. And farmers are small businesses. I know not all your listeners are agriculture people, but just think of it as a small business where you got to borrow $1 million just to restock those shelves or whatever it is, whatever the widget is that you're selling. And then you're not going to be able to harvest that for another year. So this inflation is just killing people, and the lack of people for the jobs we have is just exploding. It's been a problem for 15 years, but now it's just unbearable.
Yeah, and the thing is, Senator, I know on shows like this, we're hyper-political. We focus on this stuff. The show's based in D.C. You know, this is what I do. It's what, our core listeners care about. It's all the ins and outs of politics and some of the culture war stuff. The vast majority, I would say, of Americans aren't political nerds, and I love political nerds because I am one, but just average people. There's a reason why Joe Biden these policies under this president, right? That's just, it's not necessarily a super partisan statement to say that. I'm not a fan of his. I make no bones about that, but that is the reality for so many Americans, and I think that's why the polling has looked the way that it has for so long, right? I mean, that's the core of it.
You nailed it again, Guy. No one back home on this last trip asked me, what exactly is the national debt and what's the debt ceiling? It comes out in symptoms. There are symptoms of this inflation and why they can't find people for the jobs that we have. So one of the more common questions I get is, what was Joe Biden thinking when he left Afghanistan? Why can't Joe Biden control the border? Why do we have $5 a gallon gasoline? And I have to stop and say, wait a second. That's what this president wants. He wants 10,000 people crossing the border every day. He wants this war in Ukraine to be drawn out. He literally wants to attack our civil liberties. So this is very calculated. And the poor folks back home are just pulling their hair out, wondering where is there any common sense in this? The average Kansan spending $800 more a month now on basic necessities since Joe Biden was sworn into the office.
Right, that's the crunch. And you said you identify symptoms that are sort of these bigger picture issues. And of course, you're a doctor, so that makes sense, identifying symptoms. Part of the job, applying that to politics here as well. I do want to ask you about something that happened just a few days ago in the Senate, sort of an interesting move. The House, held by Republicans, as you noted a few moments ago, they had passed a rescinding of this student loan nonsense from the Biden administration. Whether you like the policy or not, whether you think it's helpful or not, to me, it's just flagrantly illegal. I think the Supreme Court is going to rule that way sometime very soon. But the House passed a bill saying this cannot happen. It went to the Senate, which is not held by the Republican Party, not held by your party, and yet that resolution just passed the Senate on a bipartisan basis. You had Manchin, you had Sinema, you also had John Tester. I'll just say John Tester votes like a moderate independent 1 out of every 6 years. When he's in cycle, all of a sudden he's the moderate back home. But 5 out of 6 years he's Chuck Schumer with a flat top haircut. So I don't really give a lot of credit to John Tester, who's putting on a show for the folks back in Montana. Nevertheless, he was one of several Democrats to vote with the Republicans on this. Now you've got the entire legislative branch on the record, both houses, against this. and probably the courts and the Supreme Court sometime soon. That seems like a pretty significant repudiation, yes?
You got it again. This is something folks back home bring up every round table. Without question, they're going to say, what was the president thinking when he wants to pay off student loans for people? In Kansas, we're really across America. When we take out a loan, we expect to repay it. How do I look those folks that finished high school at age 18? They started a good union job there in the aerospace manufacturing sector of Wichita, and they've worked their whole life here. They didn't take on any student loan. They're making $80,000 a year now. They've got a little retirement. They got a fishing boat. How do I tell them, oh, by the way, the President of the United States now has the power of the purse. He wants to borrow another $300 billion from your grandchildren and pay these people's loans back. It doesn't pass the smell test. This is why Americans don't trust him. They have no confidence in this president. This is why his numbers are down. It is absolutely just unconscionable decisions like this. I don't know how to explain it, Guy. You'll have to explain it to me. I'm beside myself.
Well, on the student loan thing, it's not only bad policy, I think it's fundamentally unfair and, in my opinion, we'll see if the court agrees, illegal. So that's sort of like a trifecta of bad. I know it benefits some people, but nowhere close to a majority of Americans. And that's, I think, part of the argument against it, at least from a political standpoint. U.S. Senator and medical doctor Roger Marshall, our guest. He's one of the senators from Kansas. And, sir, we so appreciate your time. Have a great weekend. Let me know what your family thinks of the long drink, and we'll have you back soon.
Now, where do I go to find that? Longdrink.com, is that it?
The Long Drink. TheLongDrink.com, and it's all right
Got
there.
it.
Yes,
okay,
sir.
Guys, I can't wait. It'll be a good weekend present for my family. You take care.
Sounds good. Appreciate